The research vessel Eternal Scholar hung in low orbit above the dead world, its sensors sweeping across continents of ash and ruin. Dr. Al pressed his face closer to the observation window, all four of his eyes studying the gray landscape below. 30 years he had spent digging through the bones of extinct civilizations. 30 years of cataloging the failures of species that had burned too bright and too fast. But Earth was different. Earth was special. The humans had possessed nuclear fire. They had split the atom and built weapons that could crack planets. The Council's official records said they had turned those weapons on themselves, reducing their world to radioactive glass in a final spasm of violence. It was a common enough story. Many species reached the atomic threshold and failed to cross it. They called it the Great Filter, and humanity had simply been one more casualty. Al's assistant, a young female named approached with a data tablet clutched in her thin fingers. Her scales were the pale blue of youth, not yet darkened by age and experience. She was eager to prove herself on this expedition, though Al suspected she would lose that eagerness once she truly understood what they studied here. Death on a planetary scale had a way of dimming enthusiasm. "Dr. Al," she said, "the ground teams have found something. They're requesting your presence immediately." He turned from the window with a sigh. "Another weapons cache, more bones." "No, sir, they've found a sealed structure, underground beneath what their maps call the Library of Congress. The preliminary scans show it's intact, completely intact." Al's four eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of genuine surprise among his people. "That's impossible. The surface radiation levels would have destroyed anything within the first century. The earthquakes alone." "I know, sir, but the readings don't lie. Whatever's down there, the humans built it to last." The shuttle ride down took 3 hours. Al spent the time reviewing what little the Council knew about human architecture. They had been clever builders, these apes, constructing structures that could withstand earthquakes and storms and even, it seemed, nuclear apocalypse. They could learn much from their engineering, even if their wisdom had been lacking. The excavation site sprawled across what had once been a human city. The buildings were long gone, reduced to foundations and memories, but the dig teams had cleared away centuries of debris to reveal something remarkable. A door, massive, made of some alloy the scanners couldn't quite identify, set into the bedrock itself. Human symbols covered its surface, strange angular writing that the translation algorithms were still working to decode. "We found it 3 days ago," the dig leader explained, a grizzled named who had been digging through ruins since before Al was born. "Took us that long just to clear the entrance. Whatever's behind this door, the humans wanted it protected." "Can we open it?" Scratched at his scales. "That's the strange part. There's a mechanism, some kind of lock, but it's not designed to keep people out. It's designed to keep what's inside in, protected from the outside environment, from radiation, from moisture, from decay. This vault was built to preserve something for a very long time." "How long?" "Our estimates put the construction date at roughly 10,000 years before their extinction event. They built this before they had nuclear weapons, before they had. They built it when they were still burning dead plants for fuel and fighting with sharpened metal." Al stepped closer to the door, running his fingers across the alien symbols. 10,000 years. The humans had barely crawled out of their caves at that point, yet they had built something that could survive the end of their world. "Open it," he said. The mechanism was old but functional. Air hissed as ancient seals broke for the first time in. The door swung inward, revealing darkness that the lights quickly banished. And then Al saw what the humans had deemed worthy of protection across all those years. Books, millions of them. Shelves stretching into the distance, row after row after row, each one filled with bound pages and scrolls and tablets of clay and stone. Some were written on paper, others on animal skin, others on materials Al couldn't identify. Temperature and humidity controls still hummed in the walls, maintained by power sources that had outlasted the civilization that created them. "It's a library," a whispered beside him. "They built all of this to protect books." The excavation of the vault took months. They cataloged every item, scanned every page, fed every symbol into their translation matrices. What they found made no sense to them at first. These weren't technical manuals or scientific texts. They weren't histories in the way they understood history. They were stories, fiction, tales of beings that had never existed, events that had never occurred, worlds that had never been. The humans had built an indestructible vault to protect their lives. Dr. Al spent long nights in his quarters aboard the Eternal Scholar, reading the translated texts and trying to understand. There was one about a man named Odysseus who spent 10 years trying to return home from a war, facing monsters and gods and temptations along the way. There was another about a king named Arthur who pulled a sword from a stone and built a kingdom based on justice rather than strength. There were hundreds about a figure called Robin Hood, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. None of it had happened. The humans knew it hadn't happened. They had written scholarly analyses proving that these figures were invented, that the events were impossible, that the magic and monsters were nothing but imagination. And yet they had told these stories over and over again, passed them down through generations, protected them against the end of the world itself. The council grew interested in the discovery, though not for the reasons Al had hoped. They saw the vault as a curiosity, a glimpse into the primitive psychology of a failed species. They allowed the translated texts to be uploaded to the Galactic Network as a matter of academic interest, never expecting anyone beyond a few to care about the mythology of dead apes. They were wrong. The first incident occurred on a cargo hauler called the Merchant's Fortune, operating in the lawless space of the Outer Rim. Pirates had been preying on shipping lanes for years, and the Merchant's Fortune had the misfortune of carrying valuable medical supplies through their territory. 600 raiders boarded the ship, expecting the crew of 43 to surrender without a fight. That was the sensible thing to do. That was what crews always did. But the captain of the Merchant's Fortune had read the human stories. She had spent her off hours devouring the tales from the vault, and one in particular had lodged in her mind. A story about 300 humans who stood against an army of millions, fighting to the last to buy time for their people to escape. The pirates expected surrender. What they got was a message broadcast across every channel in the sector, the captain's voice steady and calm as she quoted words written by a species that had been dead for 5,000 years. She said, "Come and take them." The crew of the Merchant's Fortune held the boarding tubes for 19 hours. They used fire extinguishers as weapons, welding torches as swords, pieces of the ship itself as shields and barricades. They died, all of them, but they took 412 pirates with them. The raiders had won, but their victory was so costly that they abandoned piracy entirely, their clans broken by losses they could never recover from. The story spread. A cargo crew had stood against overwhelming odds because of something they read in a human book. Other captains began reading the translations. Other crews began training. The pirates of the Outer Rim found that ships no longer surrendered easily, that merchants were now willing to die rather than submit. Within 6 months, piracy in the Outer Rim had dropped by 60%. The council noticed. They could hardly fail to notice. Reports came in from across civilized space of strange changes in behavior, of species acting in ways that made no logical sense. A slave uprising used tactics described in human resistance literature. A group of scientists refused to continue weapons research for their hegemony masters, citing something called ethical objections. A warrior challenged his clan chief to single combat, demanding that the strong protect the weak instead of exploiting them. All of them had read the human stories. Dr. Al found himself summoned to appear before the Council's Security Committee, facing a semicircle of representatives from the galaxy's most powerful species. They wanted to know what he had found in that vault. They wanted to know what poison the dead humans had left behind. "They're just stories," he said, echoing the words that would soon be spoken by counselors far more powerful than him. "Fiction, entertainment, how can lies harm anyone?" But even as he said it, Al knew he was wrong. He had spent 3 decades studying extinct civilizations, and he had never seen anything like this. The told stories too, as did every species in the galaxy. But stories were cautionary tales, warnings about what happened to those who broke the rules. Human stories were different. Human stories were about breaking the rules and winning, about standing alone against armies and somehow surviving, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they believed they could. The humans had told themselves stories about what they wanted to become, and then they had become those stories. Now their myths were loose in the galaxy, infecting other species with the same dangerous ideas. And Al, watching the council debate how to contain the contamination, suspected that it was already far too late. Ambassador Al of the Hegemony stood before the full Galactic Council, her scales flushed dark with anger. She was one of the most powerful beings in civilized space, representative of an empire that had conquered 12 species and held 36 more in client servitude. For 600 years, the hegemony had maintained order through strength, crushing any resistance before it could spread. But now something was spreading that she could not crush. "Production in the labor colonies has fallen by 40%, she announced, her voice echoing through the great chamber. 40%. Do you understand what that means? We are talking about the backbone of galactic commerce, the foundation upon which all our prosperity is built, and it is crumbling because workers are refusing to work." Councillor Oss, representing the neutral worlds, clicked his eye stalks in a gesture of concern. "What are their demands?" "They want rights." Al spat the word like it was poison. "They want limitations on working hours. They want safety regulations. They want the ability to refuse dangerous assignments. They want dignity." She paused, letting the absurdity of it sink in. "These are laborers. They are property. They have been property for 6 generations. And now they speak of dignity as if they were free beings." "Where did they learn these concepts?" asked High Chancellor Al of the Unity Collective, an ancient being whose cybernetic implants made him more machine than flesh. "The language has no word for such things." "From the human texts. They have been translating them into their own tongue, spreading them through the colonies, reading them aloud in their barracks at night. They call their movement Spartacus, after some human slave who led a rebellion thousands of years ago." The council chamber fell silent. They all knew about the human stories now. It had been 3 years since the vault was opened, and in that time the translated texts had spread across every network, every world, every species. What had begun as academic curiosity had become something far more dangerous. Dr. Al sat in the observer's gallery, watching the proceedings with growing unease. He had been called to provide expert testimony, to explain what the humans had believed and why. But the more he learned, the less he understood. These were just stories. Fiction. How could fiction change the behavior of real beings? The answer, he was beginning to realize, lay in what the humans had believed stories were for. The told stories to preserve knowledge, to record history, to warn the young about the dangers of the world. The told stories to celebrate great victories and mourn great defeats. The told stories to explain natural phenomena before they had science to do it for them. But humans had told stories for a different reason. They told stories to change themselves. A human child reading about King Arthur didn't just learn facts about medieval politics. That child learned what a king could be, should be, if kings were good. A human adult reading about Odysseus didn't just learn about Greek geography. That adult learned that persistence and cleverness could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. The stories weren't describing the world as it was. They were describing the world as humans wanted it to be, and in doing so, they gave humans a template to follow. Now other species were finding those templates. The delegate rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent. They were known throughout the galaxy as the gentlest of the major species, pacifists who had never raised a weapon in their long history. They settled disputes through meditation and compromise. They abhorred violence of any kind. My people have also been reading the human texts, she said, her voice soft but carrying through the chamber with perfect clarity. We have found them disturbing. They glorify conflict, celebrate warfare, praise those who shed blood. By every standard we hold dear, these stories are barbaric. Al made a sound of agreement. Then you support restrictions on their distribution. I did not say that. The large eyes blinked slowly. We found them disturbing because they forced us to confront questions we had long avoided. Our pacifism has kept us safe, yes, but it has also made us complicit. When the hegemony conquered we did nothing. When they raided the outer rim colonies, we did nothing. We told ourselves that violence was always wrong, that neutrality was always right. But the human stories ask a different question. They ask what we should do when neutrality allows evil to flourish. The chamber erupted in murmurs. They had never spoken this way before. They had always been reliable allies of the status, too peaceful to cause problems, too weak to matter if they did. The humans had a concept, the delegate continued. They called it just war theory, the idea that sometimes, in some circumstances, violence is not merely permitted but required. That standing by while innocents suffer is itself a form of evil. We are still debating these ideas among ourselves. We have not reached any conclusions. But for the first time in our history, we are asking whether our peace has been purchased at too high a price. Al watched the reactions around the chamber. The hegemony delegates looked alarmed. The neutral worlds looked thoughtful. They looked interested, their warrior pride stirred by the suggestion that even pacifists might embrace combat. And underlying all of it was a current of fear, the recognition that something fundamental was shifting in the galaxy's order. The human stories weren't just entertainment. They weren't just lies preserved by a dead species. They were seeds, planted in the minds of those who read them, growing into ideas that had never existed in alien soil before. After the session ended, Al found himself approached by a young servant, one of the workers who kept the council chambers clean and functioning. They were small, fragile-looking beings with delicate features and large, expressive eyes. They had been conquered so long ago that most had forgotten they had ever been anything other than slaves. "You are the one who found the vault," the servant said, keeping her voice low. "The one who gave us the stories." Al hesitated. Speaking with servants was not forbidden, but it was unusual. They were supposed to be invisible, unremarkable, part of the furniture rather than the company. "I found them, yes. I did not give them to anyone. They were released by the Council for academic study." "My people do not care why they were released. We only care that they exist." They looked up at him with eyes that burned with something Al had never seen in her species before. "We have read about Spartacus, about the American slaves who escaped through something called an underground railroad, about the French who stormed the Bastille, about humans throughout history who were told they were nothing, who were treated as property, who were expected to accept their fate, and who refused." "Those are just stories," Al said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Perhaps, but they are stories about what is possible, and now that we know what is possible, we cannot unknow it. We cannot return to believing that our chains are natural, that our suffering is inevitable, that we deserve what has been done to us." She straightened, a gesture of pride that should have been beaten out of her generations ago. "The humans are dead, but they left us a gift more valuable than any technology, any weapon, any resource. They left us hope." She walked away before Al could respond, disappearing into the corridors of the council building to resume her invisible existence. But she was no longer invisible to him. He saw her now, truly saw her, and he wondered how many others like her existed throughout the galaxy. How many servants and slaves and conquered peoples were reading the human stories and learning that their circumstances were not their destiny. The council had thought they were studying a dead civilization. They had thought the stories were harmless relics of a failed species, interesting only as historical curiosities. They had not understood that the humans had never really been interested in describing the world as it was. They had always been more interested in changing it. And now, even from beyond the grave, they were succeeding. The signal came from the void between galaxies, from a region of space so empty that no ship had traveled there in recorded history. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from background radiation, but as the listening stations focused their arrays, the pattern became unmistakable. It was not natural. It was not random. It was a message, repeating on a loop, encoded in a format that the galaxy's translation algorithms recognized immediately. It was human. High Chancellor Al stared at the report, his cybernetic eyes processing the data faster than any organic mind could manage. 15 years had passed since the vault was opened, 15 years of turmoil and change, and rising unrest throughout civilized space. The human stories had spread further than anyone had imagined possible, infecting species that had never heard of Earth, changing minds that had been closed for. The rebellion had succeeded in 3 systems. They had formed their first defensive military in history. The warrior clans were fracturing along ideological lines, some embracing the human concept of honor while others rejected it as weakness. And now this, a signal from beyond the edge of everything, claiming to be from humans. "It must be a hoax," Al said, her voice tight with tension. "The humans are dead. They destroyed themselves. We have the archaeological evidence." "We have evidence of a nuclear war," Al replied. He had aged in the years since the vault was opened, his scales fading to gray, his movements slower than they once were. But his mind was as sharp as ever, sharpened by the mystery he had dedicated his life to understanding. "We have evidence of massive casualties and collapse, but we never found evidence of extinction. We assumed it because it fit our models. We never proved it." The Council dispatched its fastest ship, a diplomatic vessel crewed by representatives from a dozen species. Al insisted on being aboard, and no one had the authority or the desire to refuse him. He had started this, after all. He had opened the vault and released the stories. If the humans were truly out there, he needed to understand why. The journey took months, even at maximum speed. The ship traveled beyond the spiral arms of the galaxy, beyond the scattered dwarf systems that orbited its edge, into the great emptiness between island universes. The crew grew nervous as the stars fell away behind them, replaced by an endless darkness broken only by the distant glow of other galaxies, impossibly far away. The signal grew stronger as they approached its source. And then, on the 93rd day of their journey, they found what was waiting for them. Ships, thousands of them, arranged in formations that suggested both military discipline and aesthetic appreciation. They were beautiful, their hulls curving in ways that seemed to defy engineering, their surfaces gleaming with light that had no apparent source. And they were undeniably human in design, bearing the same symbols that covered the vault door, the same angular writing that had taken years to fully translate. The lead ship hailed them, and a face appeared on the. It was human, unmistakably human, though subtly different from the images in the archaeological record. The features were sharper, the eyes deeper, the bone structure refined in ways that suggested generations of deliberate improvement. But the essential humanity remained, the same strange mix of vulnerability and determination that characterized every image Al had ever studied. "Greetings," the human said. Her voice was warm, almost friendly, with none of the hostility that Al had feared. "I am Admiral Way of the Terran diaspora. We've been waiting for you." The negotiations that followed were unlike anything the Council had experienced. The humans did not threaten. They did not demand. They simply talked, explaining what they had done and why, filling in the gaps that the archaeological record had left empty. They had known the nuclear war was coming. Not the specific date or the specific cause, but the general shape of it, the inevitable consequence of their nature and their technology and their failure to evolve quickly enough to handle both. So they had made plans. They had built ships in secret, launched them toward the void, sent the best of their species on a journey that would take centuries to complete. And they had left the vault behind. We knew someone would find it eventually, Admiral explained, sitting across from Al in a conference room aboard her flagship. She was old by human standards, her hair silver, her face lined with the marks of a long life. But her eyes were young, burning with a vitality that seemed impossible in someone who had lived so many years. We knew our stories would spread. That was the point. The point of what? Al asked. What were you trying to accomplish? We were trying to plant seeds. The Admiral smiled, and there was something almost gentle in it. Almost. When we left Earth, we knew we weren't ready to join the galactic community. We had too much growing still to do, too many mistakes still to make. If we had announced ourselves then, we would have been just another young species, aggressive and ambitious and dangerous. The Council would have watched us carefully, contained us, made sure we never became a threat. Instead, you chose to wait. Instead, we chose to prepare the ground. We left our stories behind because we knew they would do what we could not. They would spread the ideas that made us human. Not our technology, not our weapons, not our power. Our values, our dreams. Our fundamental belief that things can always be better, that no situation is hopeless, that individuals matter even against impossible odds. Al thought about what he had seen in the years since the vault was opened. The slaves who had read about Spartacus and decided they could be free. The pacifists who had read about just war and decided they could fight for justice. The warriors who had read about chivalry and decided that strength meant protection rather than exploitation. You changed the galaxy, he said, with nothing but stories. Stories are never nothing. Admiral leaned forward, her eyes intense. Stories are how we teach ourselves what we want to become. Every culture tells stories, but most cultures use them to reinforce what already exists, to justify the present order, to make the way things are seem natural and inevitable. Human stories are different. Human stories imagine alternatives. They ask what if. They dream of better worlds and then inspire people to build them. And now the galaxy is ready for us. The Admiral gestured toward the viewport where ships from a dozen different species had begun arriving over the past several days, and others that Al didn't recognize, all drawn by the signal, all coming to see if the legends were true. Look at them. They've been reading our stories for 15 years. They've been changing, growing, becoming something new, not human but touched by humanity, infected by our dreams. Al looked. He saw ships that had once belonged to enemies flying in formation together. He saw species that had been at war for centuries exchanging peaceful communications. He saw a galaxy transformed by nothing more than words on a page, ideas planted in minds, stories that refused to die even when the species that created them should have. The Council won't accept this, he said. They'll fight you, they'll try to contain you. Some will, Admiral agreed, and we'll meet them with everything we have, not because we want to conquer the galaxy, but because we want to free it. The same stories that inspired slaves to rebel and pacifists to fight will inspire us to stand against any who would preserve the old order of exploitation and control. She stood, walking to the viewport to gaze out at the gathering fleet. We left Earth because we knew we weren't ready. We spent 5,000 years in the void, growing, changing, becoming worthy of the dreams we had always told ourselves about. Now we're back, and we're not alone. Al joined her at the viewport. In the distance, he could see more ships arriving, more species drawn by the signal, more beings who had read the human stories and found something in them worth believing in. The galaxy would never be the same. The old powers would fall, the old orders would crumble, and something new would rise from the ashes. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was exactly what the humans had planned 5,000 years ago when they built a vault to protect their most precious treasures. Not gold, not weapons, not technology, just stories. Stories about what beings could become if they dared to imagine something better. stories that had survived the death of a world and the silence of to transform a galaxy. "You knew," Al said softly. "All along you knew this would happen." "We hoped," Admiral replied. "Hope is all we've ever had. Hope and stories to keep it alive." She turned to him, and her smile was radiant with something that Al finally recognized from all the tales he had read over the past 15 years. It was hope, pure, undying, impossibly stubborn hope, the kind that could survive nuclear fire and empty centuries and the death of everything else, the kind that could transform a galaxy simply by suggesting that transformation was possible. Humanity had returned, but the truth was they had never really left. Their stories had kept them alive in the minds of those who read them, preserved them in the imaginations of species who had never seen a human face. And now those stories had prepared the way for their creators to return, not as conquerors but as inspirations. Al thought about his 30 years of studying extinct civilizations, cataloging the failures of species that had burned too bright and too fast. He had always believed humanity was just another cautionary tale. Now he understood that they had been something far more remarkable. They had been a promise that no matter how dark things got, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed, there was always a story that said tomorrow could be better. And now tomorrow had finally arrived.